Kathy Miller stood at the doorway of her old home, the house she had shared with her late husband for over 3 decades, feeling the weight of silence press down on her shoulders. The air, once filled with laughter and the soft murmur of everyday life, had grown thick with memories that now felt like ghosts haunting her every step. George, her beloved partner, was gone, and with him, the heartbeat of the home. She had spent years building a life together, weaving each day into a tapestry of love, but now, without him, the house felt too big, too empty. The walls, once familiar and comforting, felt cold, as if they were slowly closing in on her. It had been Sarah, her daughter, who had suggested the move. "Why don't you stay with us for a while?" Sarah had asked, her voice coated with a blend of concern and practicality. Kathy hesitated. She didn't want to intrude, but the loneliness of her home had become unbearable. So she packed her bags and left behind the place where every corner held a memory of George, the place that had once been filled with love, laughter, and family. She hoped that moving in with Sarah would be a temporary solution, a way to escape the silence that had crept into her life. But when Kathy stepped into Sarah's home, she realized that the life she had left behind was not just a house. It was a home. Sarah's home was sleek, modern, and sterile, with white countertops, polished floors, and rooms that echoed with emptiness. There was no warmth, no personal touch. It felt like a museum, a space designed to impress, but not to live in. Kathy was given a guest room, beautiful, yet unfamiliar, a place where she could sleep, but never truly feel at home. Sarah's polite smiles never reached her eyes, and Kathy felt like an outsider in the very family she had given everything for. Every gesture, every word from Sarah felt like it came with an unspoken condition. Be helpful, but don't be too much. Be here, but don't take up space. Kathy tried to fit in, to make herself useful. She helped with the kids, cooked meals, and kept the house tidy. But no matter how much she did, she never seemed to truly belong. Sarah's cold politeness became harder to bear, and Kathy began to realize that her presence was not a blessing, but an inconvenience, something to be tolerated. The house, which had seemed like a refuge at first, soon began to feel like a gilded cage. Kathy could sense the unease in the air, the unspoken words between Sarah and Michael, her son-in-law. She could feel them looking at her, judging her presence, questioning whether she was really needed. It was not just the silence that filled the house. It was the feeling of being watched, of being the invisible presence in someone else's life. She was there, but she wasn't truly seen. One day, as Kathy sat in the guest room sipping tea, she noticed a small red light blinking in the corner of the ceiling. At first, she thought it was nothing, just a part of the security system. But the more she looked at it, the more it unsettled her. Something in her gut told her that this wasn't just a harmless device. It was a camera, watching her every move. And as she lay in bed that night, the blinking light seemed to mock her, a constant reminder that she was no longer the woman she once was. She was no longer the mother, the caretaker, the center of her family's world. Now, she was just a subject, a specimen in someone else's experiment. Kathy couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep inside her. It had started as a subtle discomfort, the feeling that she was being watched, but it quickly turned into something much darker. Every day, the house felt colder, emptier. Sarah's smiles became even more strained, her attempts at conversation increasingly awkward, as if Kathy's presence was a disruption in the carefully curated world Sarah and Michael had built. There was no room for her in their sleek, modern home. No room for the woman who had raised Sarah, who had dedicated her life to her family, to making sure everyone felt loved, cared for. In the beginning, Kathy had tried so hard to make herself useful, to blend into the rhythm of Sarah and Michael's life. She picked up the kids from school, she cooked dinner, and she kept the house tidy, hoping that her efforts would prove that she was still a valuable part of the family. But with every polite thank you from Sarah, Kathy felt smaller. She began to retreat into herself, hiding in her room after dinner, avoiding interactions with her daughter and son-in-law. The isolation was suffocating. It wasn't just that they didn't need her, it was that they didn't seem to want her. Kathy had spent her entire life giving, but now she was constantly giving, trying to please, and still feeling invisible. The more she tried to fit in, the more she felt like an outsider in her own daughter's home. It wasn't just the physical space that felt off, it was the emotional distance. There was no place for her here. Not really. Sarah and Michael never asked her opinion, never sought her advice. She was the mother-in-law, the guest, the person who was supposed to be grateful for their generosity in letting her stay. It was as though they had built their life around the idea that she would always be there, but never truly be present. Kathy's heart ached with every passing day. She missed the days when her family had gathered around the kitchen table, when their conversations were filled with warmth and love. Here, at Sarah's house, there was only silence and polite words. But as much as she longed for the comfort of the old days, Kathy couldn't ignore the creeping realization that something was off. There was a subtle tension in the air, an invisible weight that hung over every interaction. She didn't belong here. She wasn't truly wanted. Sarah may have smiled and told her she was welcome, but Kathy could feel the truth in every glance, every unspoken word. She wasn't the mother she used to be. She wasn't the woman who mattered. She was just a fixture in someone else's life, a part of a family that had moved on without her. And the thought of being forgotten, of being reduced to a mere presence that no one needed, crushed her spirit. She began to realize that the love she had always given so freely to her family had been taken for granted. And now, it seemed, it had been replaced with something colder, something far less forgiving. Kathy couldn't deny the truth that had been lingering in the back of her mind for weeks. The house wasn't a home anymore. It was a cage. Her daughter's house, which she had once imagined as a sanctuary, had become a place where she felt like an unwelcome guest. The walls, once meant to shelter and protect, now felt cold and unyielding. Every corner of the house was meticulously curated, and every action Kathy made, every step she took, seemed to disturb the illusion of order that Sarah and Michael had so carefully constructed. At first, Kathy tried to dismiss the growing feeling of discomfort. She told herself she was being paranoid. After all, Sarah had invited her to stay. She had reassured Kathy that there was more than enough room for her, and that she would always be welcome. But the small things, Sarah's smile that never quite reached her eyes, the subtle way Michael's tone changed when he spoke to her, began to eat away at Kathy's sense of belonging. It was as though their kindness was a facade, one they put on to make themselves feel better, but beneath it, they were simply tolerating her presence. Kathy had been invisible before, but now, in her daughter's home, she felt like a ghost, drifting through the halls unnoticed. One day, as Kathy sat in the living room, she overheard a conversation between Sarah and Michael. They were talking about her, thinking she couldn't hear them. Their words were like a slap to her face. It wasn't anger that she felt. No, it was something much worse. It was the quiet realization that she was no longer needed. She was no longer a mother, a caregiver, a part of the fabric of their lives. She was an inconvenience, an outsider in her own family. That moment shattered something deep inside Kathy. She wasn't just hurt. She was betrayed. For years, she had given everything to her family, her time, her love, her sacrifices, but all of it had been taken for granted. And now, in the silence that filled the house, Kathy understood what Sarah and Michael had never said aloud. They didn't want her there. They had never wanted her to be part of their lives in the way she had hoped. She wasn't needed, and she wasn't wanted. They had replaced her with something more convenient, something easier to control. And Kathy had no choice but to accept that the life she had imagined for herself in this house was an illusion. It was in that moment that Kathy realized she could no longer live this way. She wasn't going to be silenced anymore. She wasn't going to shrink into the shadows of their perfect life. She would take back control of her life, no matter the cost. She would show Sarah and Michael that she wasn't someone to be ignored. She was a woman with her own story, and it was time for that story to be told. Kathy's heart was heavy as she walked through the house that had once been a symbol of family. Every room seemed to echo with memories, but not the warm, comforting ones she had hoped for. It was as though Sarah and Michael had unwittingly carved away the space where Kathy once belonged. What had once been a home full of laughter and love now felt like an elaborate stage set, where she was playing a role she never agreed to. She was no longer a mother, no longer part of the foundation of this family. She was an accessory, something to be displayed, perhaps admired for a moment, but then tucked away out of sight. Her mind churned as she walked through the empty hallways, the weight of everything she had endured settling like a stone in her chest. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached the kitchen counter, the place where Sarah always insisted things be placed, just so. Kathy used to find comfort in these little rituals, in knowing that her daughter needed her help. But now, they felt suffocating. Every move she made was scrutinized, every small gesture judged. Kathy realized that, no matter how hard she tried to adapt to their world, she would never truly fit in again. Not because she had changed, but because they had stopped seeing her as a person in her own right. What was even more painful was the sense of disconnection. She had spent years nurturing her children, helping them grow, giving them everything she could, only to find herself invisible in their eyes. Their world, which had once been so full of promise, now felt alien to her. Her role as a mother, a protector, had been replaced by something quieter, more insidious. The more she tried to reach out, the more they pulled away. Kathy's reflection in the kitchen window only reinforced her isolation. The tired lines on her face were a map of the years she had spent giving of herself to others, while asking for nothing in return. She had poured her love into Sarah and Michael, thinking that it would always be enough, but it had never been enough for them. They had taken everything she gave without a second thought, and now they were taking the last thing she had, her sense of belonging. But Kathy wasn't defeated. The truth settled in her bones, and in that moment, a quiet resolve began to take shape. She had been a mother, a caregiver, a woman who had lived for others. Now it was time to live for herself. The world had changed around her, but she was no longer willing to play the part of the invisible mother. Kathy wasn't just walking away from a house, she was reclaiming herself. She was going to find a space where she could exist freely, without judgment, without expectations. And she would make sure Sarah and Michael understood the price of taking someone's presence for granted. Kathy stood outside the small cottage, her heart thumping in her chest. The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon, casting a soft golden light over the garden. It was quiet, a silence she hadn't known she needed until now. For the first time in years, Kathy felt a peace she couldn't explain. No expectations hanging over her head, no constant need to prove herself, no pressure to be someone else's idea of what she should be. She took a deep breath and let it out slowly, letting the weight of everything she had endured slip away. The years spent bending to Sarah and Michael's will, the constant push to conform to their idea of how she should live, had drained her in ways she hadn't even realized. But this place, this was hers. Every corner, every inch of space felt like a reclaiming of herself. She had made a decision not just to leave their home, but to leave behind the version of herself she had been forced into. She was no longer just Kathy, the caregiver, the mother figure. She was Kathy, the woman who deserved to be seen, heard, and valued. The soft rustling of the leaves in the backyard became the only sound that mattered. Kathy's eyes wandered over the small flower beds she had started to tend, the little plants she'd chosen and nurtured as her own. They were hers in a way nothing else had ever been. In Sarah and Michael's house, she had been an accessory, an object to be hidden away and occasionally shown. But here, in this cottage, Kathy was everything. She was the gardener, the writer, the artist of her own life. She was no longer invisible. Her thoughts wandered back to the last conversation she had with Sarah and Michael. They had expected her to walk away quietly, to accept their terms, as she always had. But Kathy had learned something in those weeks of solitude. She learned that love wasn't something to be given away without boundaries, without acknowledgement of one's own worth. And she had learned that she could still matter, even without their approval. As she stood in the garden, a sense of pride filled her. This wasn't just a new chapter. It was the first chapter of a story that was entirely her own. Kathy wasn't waiting anymore for validation, for permission. She wasn't clinging to a family that had stopped seeing her. She was here, alive, and fully present in her own life. And in that moment, Kathy knew that this was the beginning of something beautiful. Not because of the house, or the garden, or the silence, but because, for the first time in a long time, she had chosen herself. Kathy's journey is one of rediscovery and reclaiming her self-worth. After years of being overlooked and controlled, she found the courage to walk away from a life that no longer served her. In the solitude of her new home, Kathy realized that peace comes not from fitting into others' expectations, but from embracing who you truly are. The quiet that once felt suffocating became her sanctuary, allowing her to reconnect with herself. Her story teaches us that sometimes the only way to find ourselves is by stepping away from what holds us back. We must never forget that our value is not determined by others' perceptions, but by the love and respect we give ourselves. Lesson. The lesson Kathy teaches us is the power of self-worth. When we are no longer afraid to stand up for ourselves and create boundaries, we open the door to true personal growth. Apply this in your life by recognizing your needs and taking steps to protect your peace and happiness, no matter how hard it might seem. Question for the audience. What would you do if you discovered your family was spying on you? A. Confront them directly and demand an explanation. B. Leave quietly and never look back. Please leave your answers in the comments below and share your thoughts. We would love to hear your perspective on this situation. Don't forget to subscribe to support the channel and help us keep creating more content that speaks to the heart.